Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. A Chance Encounter. The rain had been relentless that day, cascading down in silvery sheets and drenching the streets of Montreal. Amelia tightened her scarf around her neck as she darted into the small cafe on Rue Saint-Denis, the bell above the door jingling softly. The warm air inside was a balm to her cold, damp skin, carrying with it the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and buttery pastries. She glanced around, her eyes scanning for an empty seat. The cafe was crowded, with students hunched over laptops, couples murmuring over shared desserts, and lone patrons absorbed in their books. In the corner by the window, a man sat alone, his gaze fixed on the downpour outside. He had an air of quiet intensity about him. A dark overcoat hung loosely on his shoulders, and his hair was slightly tousled, as if he had just stepped out of the rain. When their eyes met, Amelia felt a strange jolt, as if the universe had shifted slightly off its axis. "Looking for a seat?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "Seems like it's the only one left," she replied, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "Be my guest." She settled into the chair, setting her dripping umbrella aside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was oddly comfortable, punctuated only by the clatter of cups and the hum of conversation around them. "I'm Daniel," he said, breaking the quiet. "Amelia," she responded, offering a small smile. The conversation flowed easily after that. They talked about everything and nothing, the unpredictable weather, the best bookshops in the city, and their mutual love for late-night jazz. Amelia found herself laughing at his dry wit, and Daniel seemed genuinely interested in her ramblings about her favorite art galleries. Hours slipped by unnoticed. The rain outside had slowed to a gentle drizzle, the streetlights casting a golden glow over the glistening pavement. Amelia glanced at her watch and realized with a start that it was nearly midnight. "I should go," she said reluctantly, gathering her things. "Wait," Daniel said, his hand brushing against hers as he reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small notebook and scribbled something on a page before tearing it out and handing it to her. "Call me?" he asked, his expression hopeful. Amelia hesitated for a moment before taking the note. "I will," she promised, tucking it into her pocket. As she stepped out into the night, the cold air biting at her cheeks, Amelia felt an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. She hadn't felt this way in years, hopeful, exhilarated, and a little scared. The next morning, she reached for the note, her heart pounding with anticipation. She unfolded it to find a neatly written phone number and a single sentence. "I'm sorry, Amelia. I wish I could have told you everything." Her hands trembled as she stared at the words. A feeling of unease crept over her, replacing the warmth from the night before. She grabbed her phone, her fingers hovering over the keypad. What had he meant? What could he possibly be hiding? But before she could dial the number, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a news alert. Breaking: wanted fugitive sighted in Montreal. Authorities seek Daniel Armitage for alleged fraud and deception. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. The image accompanying the article was unmistakable. It was him, the man from the cafe. The man who had seemed so genuine, so kind. Her mind raced as she recalled every detail of their conversation. Had it all been a lie? Or was there more to his story than the headlines revealed? As she sat there, gripping the note in one hand and her phone in the other, Amelia realized she was standing on the edge of a choice. She could walk away, let the memory of Daniel fade into nothing. Or she could call him and uncover the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. The rain began to fall again outside, tapping against her window like a whisper urging her forward. With a deep breath, she made her decision. Chapter 2. The Call. Amelia stared at her phone for what felt like hours, the weight of the note pressing against her palm, 1,000 thoughts tangled in her mind, questions, fears, and a strange, lingering curiosity. Against every instinct telling her to let it go, her finger hovered over the dial button. Finally, she pressed it. The line rang once, twice, and then a click. A voice answered, deep and steady, but quieter than she remembered. "Hello." "Daniel," she said, her voice trembling. There was a pause, filled only by the faint sound of static. "Amelia," he said, and she could hear something in his tone, a mix of relief and regret. "What's going on?" she demanded, her grip tightening on the phone. "Why is your face in the news? Who are you really?" He sighed heavily. "I didn't want you to find out this way. I was hoping." His voice trailed off before he continued. "I'm not what they say I am, at least not entirely." "Then explain," she pressed, her heart pounding. "I can't. Not over the phone. But I'll tell you everything, if you meet me," he said. "I need you to trust me just one more time." Amelia hesitated. Trusting a man labeled a fugitive wasn't just foolish, it was dangerous. Yet something in his voice stirred a flicker of doubt in her skepticism. He hadn't sounded like a criminal last night, and he didn't sound like one now. "Where?" she asked cautiously. "I'll text you the address," he said. "But, Amelia, come alone, please." The line went dead before she could reply. Moments later, her phone buzzed with a message. The address was for an abandoned warehouse near the old port, a place she had always avoided after dark. Amelia's hands shook as she pulled on her coat. She could hear the warnings echoing in her mind. Don't go. Don't do this. But the same unshakable curiosity that had drawn her to art, to stories, to life's mysteries, now propelled her forward. The warehouse loomed before her, its crumbling facade casting jagged shadows under the dim light of a flickering street lamp. She swallowed her fear and stepped inside, her footsteps echoing across the cavernous space. "Daniel?" she called out, her voice barely audible over the hum of the wind. He emerged from the shadows, his overcoat blending with the gloom. But something about him was different now. His posture was tense, his face pale and drawn. "You came," he said softly, a trace of disbelief in his tone. "You said you'd explain," she replied, crossing her arms. "So start talking." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "The truth is, I've been running for years, not from the law, but from the people behind it." Amelia frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I used to work for an organization, a very powerful one," he said, his voice dropping. "They recruited me right out of university. At first, it seemed like an incredible opportunity, but then I discovered what they were really doing. Stealing identities, manipulating data, destroying lives for profit." He began to pace, his footsteps restless. "When I tried to expose them, they turned everything on me. They framed me, erased my history, and made me into their scapegoat. That's why I'm wanted. Not because I'm guilty, but because I know too much." Amelia's mind reeled. It sounded like something out of a spy novel, too unbelievable to be real. Yet, as she looked at him, she saw no sign of deceit, only exhaustion, fear, and a glimmer of hope. "Why tell me this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I need help," he said. "And because I meant what I said last night, I wish I could have told you everything sooner. Meeting you was the first time in years I felt human again." Before Amelia could respond, the distant sound of tires screeching cut through the air. Daniel's head snapped toward the entrance. "They've found me," he said grimly. "Who?" Amelia asked, panic rising in her chest. "Stay behind me," he ordered, pulling something from his pocket, a small device that looked like a phone but was covered in strange symbols and buttons. The warehouse doors burst open, and figures in black tactical gear stormed inside, their weapons raised. "Daniel Armitage, you're under arrest," one of them barked. Daniel stepped forward, shielding Amelia. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Stand down, Armitage." But instead of complying, Daniel pressed a button on the device. A sudden burst of light filled the room, blinding Amelia and the intruders alike. When the light faded, Daniel was gone. Amelia stumbled backward, her vision swimming. The tactical team ignored her, frantically searching the warehouse. One of them grabbed her arm. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" "I don't." She stammered, her mind racing. "She's a civilian," another voice said. "Leave her." They released her and swept through the building, their shouts echoing in the distance. Alone again, Amelia sank to the floor, her heart racing. Daniel's disappearance left more questions than answers, and in her pocket she found a second note he must have slipped to her in the chaos. It read, "Thank you for trusting me. Stay safe. I'll find you again." As she sat there, clutching the note, Amelia realized she had been pulled into a world far larger and more dangerous than she could have imagined. And she wasn't sure she wanted out. Chapter 3. Into the Rabbit Hole. The days that followed felt surreal to Amelia. as if the world around her had shifted into something darker, more mysterious. She couldn't shake the memory of Daniel vanishing in that burst of light, or the way her pulse had quickened when she read his second note. She tried to go about her normal life, her shifts at the gallery, her quiet evenings sketching by the window. But everywhere she turned, she felt eyes on her, shadows lingering too long. She knew she couldn't ignore what had happened. Late one night, she sat at her desk, the note Daniel had left lying beside her. She stared at it for what felt like hours, willing it to make sense. Her fingers traced the edges of the paper, worn from her constant handling. Then she noticed it, a faint indentation on the back, almost invisible in the dim light. Grabbing a pencil, she lightly shaded over the surface. Slowly, words began to emerge, scrawled in hurried, uneven strokes. North Point Station, midnight, come alone. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a thank you note. It was a message, a rendezvous. North Point Station was as desolate as she had expected. The old subway stop had been decommissioned years ago, its platforms crumbling and its tracks swallowed by darkness. The air was damp and smelled of rust and decay. She descended the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The dim light of her phone guided her way until she reached the platform. "Daniel?" she called out, her voice trembling. A shadow detached itself from the far wall, stepping into the faint glow of her phone. It was him. "You came," he said, his expression a mixture of relief and something darker, worry, perhaps. "You left me no choice," she shot back. "What's going on? What was that device? And why are you dragging me into this?" He held up a hand, silencing her barrage of questions. "I didn't mean to drag you into anything, Amelia, but you're here now and I need you to listen." He gestured for her to follow him. They walked deeper into the station, into a service tunnel hidden behind a rusted gate. The walls were lined with old wiring, the faint hum of electricity barely audible. "That device you saw, it's not from here," he said carefully. "Not from here," she repeated, confusion and skepticism lacing her voice. "It's technology from somewhere else," he continued, his tone serious. "Another world, another version of this one." Amelia stopped walking. "You can't be serious." He turned to face her, his eyes intense. "Do I look like I'm joking? That's why they're after me, Amelia. I didn't just stumble onto some corporate conspiracy. I stumbled onto proof that our reality isn't the only one. And the people who control this technology will do anything to keep it a secret." She stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he was saying. It sounded impossible, ridiculous. And yet, hadn't everything about the past few days defied explanation? "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I need your help," he said simply. "They know I've been in contact with you. If I don't protect you, they'll use you to get to me. But if you help me, we can expose them. Together." "Expose them how?" Daniel hesitated, then pulled a small object from his pocket. It was a smooth, metallic disc, no larger than a coin, covered in intricate engravings that seemed to shift in the dim light. "This is a key," he said. "It can open a gateway to where they store their data, their secrets. If we can get inside, we can take everything they're hiding and bring it to the world." Amelia took a step back, the weight of his words sinking in. "And what happens if we fail?" "They'll erase us," he said bluntly. "Like we never existed." Her stomach churned, fear clawing at her. But as she looked at him, she saw something in his eyes. A quiet determination, a belief in her she wasn't sure she deserved. "Why me?" she whispered. "Because I trust you," he said. "And because I think you're braver than you realize." The next few hours passed in a blur. Daniel led her to a hidden passage that connected to another part of the city. They emerged into an unassuming apartment that served as his hideout, cluttered with papers, diagrams, and strange devices. He handed her a tablet displaying schematics of a building downtown. A sleek, modern skyscraper that housed one of the most powerful tech companies in the world. "That's where the gateway is," he explained. "And that's where we'll make our move." Amelia stared at the plans, her pulse quickening. This wasn't just some wild story anymore. It was real, and she was a part of it. "Okay," she said finally, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. "I'm in." Daniel's lips curved into a faint smile. "I knew you would be." But as they finalized their plans, neither of them noticed the tiny red light blinking on a camera hidden in the corner of the room. Far away, in a darkened control room, A figure watched them on a screen, their expression unreadable. "Prepare the team," the figure said coldly. "We move tomorrow." Chapter 4. The Heist. The following night, the city pulsed with life. Cars roared down the streets, neon lights flickered in the drizzle, and the hum of voices filled the air. But in the shadow of the glass monolith that housed Orion Systems, Amelia and Daniel waited in silence, their breaths misting in the cold air. Daniel had laid out the plan with meticulous precision, but now that they were here, Amelia's nerves threatened to unravel. She clutched the metallic key in her hand, its surface cool and smooth. "You're sure this will work?" she whispered. "It has to," Daniel replied, his eyes scanning the building's entrance. "Remember, we're not here to fight. We're here to get in, grab the data, and get out before they even know we're there." "Easy for you to say," she muttered, trying to ignore the pounding of her heart. Daniel's hand brushed hers, a fleeting touch that steadied her. "You're ready, Amelia. I wouldn't have brought you if you weren't." The words settled something in her, giving her just enough courage to nod. The first part of the plan went smoothly. Disguised as employees in stolen uniforms, they entered through a side door Daniel had mapped out weeks ago. The security was sophisticated, but Daniel's knowledge of their systems, combined with the strange devices he carried, allowed them to bypass cameras and locks with ease. Inside, the building was a maze of glass and steel. The air was sterile, humming with faint vibrations from the servers deep below. They reached the elevator that would take them to the restricted sublevels. Daniel inserted the metallic key into a hidden slot beneath the panel. The doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and the elevator began to descend, far deeper than Amelia had expected. "You've done this before," she said, studying his calm demeanor. "Something like this," he admitted. "But never with stakes this high." "What happens if we pull this off?" Daniel glanced at her. "We change everything." The sublevel was a stark contrast to the polished upper floors. The walls were lined with dark, humming panels, and the air was cool and heavy. At the center of the room stood a single console, surrounded by a faint, bluish glow. Daniel approached it cautiously, motioning for Amelia to stay back. He placed the key into a slot on the console, and the glow intensified. Strange symbols appeared on the screen, shifting and morphing too quickly for Amelia to decipher. "This is it," he murmured, his fingers flying across the interface. "The gateway." Amelia watched as the air around the console shimmered, bending like heat waves. Suddenly, a rift opened, a swirling vortex of light and shadow, impossibly vast yet contained within the room. "This leads to their data hub," Daniel explained. "Everything they've stolen, everything they've hidden, it's all in there." "How do we know it's safe?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "We don't," he said simply. Before she could respond, a sharp noise cut through the air, the unmistakable sound of boots on metal. "They're here," Daniel said, his voice tight. "Go through the rift, now." "What about you?" "I'll hold them off," he said, pulling a small, sleek device from his pocket. "I've done this before, Amelia. Trust me." Her heart wrenched, but she nodded. With one last look at him, she stepped into the vortex. The transition was instantaneous and overwhelming. Amelia found herself in a vast, crystalline expanse, the air shimmering with data streams that looked like cascading waterfalls of light. It was both beautiful and disorienting. She spotted a central structure ahead, a tower of glowing threads, pulsating like a living heart. Instinctively, she moved toward it, the metallic key still clutched in her hand. When she reached the tower, the key began to vibrate, pulling her toward a slot in its base. She inserted it, and the tower lit up, streams of data converging toward her. A holographic interface appeared, displaying endless rows of files. She hesitated for only a moment before selecting everything. Back in the real world, Daniel stood his ground as the tactical team stormed the room. The first wave of agents fell to the non-lethal pulses from his device, but he knew it wouldn't hold them forever. The leader of the group stepped forward, a tall figure clad in black armor with a cold, calculating gaze. "Give it up, Armitage," the figure said. "You know you can't win." Daniel smirked. "Maybe not, but I'm not here to win. I'm here to finish." Before the leader could respond, the rift behind Daniel shimmered and expanded. A figure stepped out. Amelia, clutching a small device glowing with stored data. "You did it," Daniel breathed. But before they could celebrate, the leader barked an order. The agents raised their weapons, red dots dancing over Daniel and Amelia. "Hand over the data," the leader demanded. Amelia looked at Daniel, her chest heaving. "What now?" He grinned, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "Now, we run." With a press of a button on his device, the rift exploded outward, engulfing the room in a blinding light. When Amelia opened her eyes, she was no longer in the building. She and Daniel were standing on a rooftop overlooking the city, the stars shining brightly above them. "We did it," she whispered, clutching the device. "For now," Daniel said, his voice quiet. "But this is just the beginning." As they looked out over the city, Amelia felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. She had no idea what lay ahead, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. Daniel turned to her, a faint smile on his lips. "Thank you for trusting me." She smiled back. "Don't make me regret it." Far below, the lights of the city twinkled like 1,000 possibilities. Final chapter, The Cost of Truth. The rooftop was quiet, save for the distant hum of the city. Amelia felt the weight of the stolen device in her hands, its glow dimming as it settled into silence. For a moment, she allowed herself to hope they were safe. But then Daniel's expression shifted. His smile faltered, and his gaze flicked over her shoulder. "They're still coming," he said grimly. Amelia turned to see dark shapes moving on the neighboring rooftops, figures with weapons glinting in the moonlight. She tightened her grip on the device. "What do we do?" Daniel pulled her closer. "We use the data. Right now." "Here. How?" He reached into his jacket and retrieved the metallic key, its engravings now glowing faintly. "The key isn't just a gateway, it's also a signal." "What does it do?" "It broadcasts," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "Once activated, it will send everything we've stolen to every public server, every news outlet, every network on the planet." Amelia's breath caught. "Then do it." "There's a catch," he said, his tone heavy. "The key uses a quantum tether to link itself to whoever activates it. Once the signal is sent, the tether will break, and so will I." She stared at him, her stomach dropping. "What are you saying?" "If I use this, I won't survive," he said plainly. "But it's the only way to make sure the truth gets out." "No," Amelia said, shaking her head. "There has to be another way." There isn't time," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "Amelia, listen to me. This is why I brought you here. Not just to help me, but to be the one who keeps going after I'm gone. Someone has to make sure they can't cover this up again." Tears blurred her vision. "Daniel." "No, I can't let you do this." He cupped her face with his hands, his touch warm despite the cold night. "You can, Amelia, because you're stronger than you think, and because the world needs to know the truth." Before she could protest, he kissed her. A fleeting, desperate kiss that carried everything he couldn't say. Then he stepped back and pressed the key into her hand. "Run," he whispered. Amelia froze, unable to move, until the sound of footsteps and shouted orders snapped her out of her daze. She turned and bolted, clutching the key and the device as she raced down the fire escape. From a safe distance, Amelia watched as Daniel stood alone on the rooftop, facing the advancing agents. She saw him hold the key high, its glow intensifying until it was blinding. The light expanded, consuming everything around him. She shielded her eyes, her heart breaking as the rooftop disappeared in a brilliant flash. When the light faded, the agents were gone, the rooftop was empty, and Daniel was nowhere to be seen. The next morning, the world awoke to chaos. News outlets, social media platforms, and public forums were flooded with the leaked data. The files exposed not just Orion systems, but a vast web of corruption, cover-ups, and hidden technology that defied imagination. The public outcry was immediate. Protests erupted in cities around the globe. Governments demanded accountability. And while the people behind the conspiracy scrambled to contain the fallout, the damage was already done. Amelia watched it all unfold from a small, crowded cafe, her hood pulled low over her face. The device sat in her bag, a reminder of what they had sacrificed. As the news anchor on the screen spoke about the mysterious whistleblower known only as Armitage, Amelia felt a pang of grief and pride. He had done it. He had changed everything. Weeks later, she found herself standing on the same rooftop where she had last seen Daniel. The city stretched out before her, restless and alive. In her hand was the metallic key, now dim and lifeless. She had considered throwing it away, burying it, forgetting it ever existed. But something stopped her. As she turned to leave, she thought she heard a faint whisper in the wind, a voice she would recognize anywhere. "Thank you." She smiled through her tears, clutching the key tightly. The fight wasn't over, but she wasn't running anymore. Amelia walked away, her heart heavy, but her spirit unbroken, ready to face whatever came next. Thank you for reading this story. Chapter 1. The City of Whispers. The snow fell gently over the bustling streets of Montreal, blanketing the world in a serene silence that only winter could bring. People hurried by, their faces hidden beneath scarves and hats, their footsteps crunching against the icy sidewalks. Amid this chaos, the soft glow of cafe lights spilled onto the cobblestone, inviting anyone brave enough to linger in the cold. A young woman stood outside Le Petit Refuge, her fingers clutched around a steaming cup of coffee. Her name was Eliza, and she was lost in thought, her auburn hair tucked beneath a knit cap. Eliza had moved to the city 3 years ago for reasons she rarely shared, a mix of ambition and the need to escape her past. Montreal had been kind to her, offering her a degree of anonymity she had never known in her small hometown. Tonight, though, something felt different. Across the street, a man leaned casually against a lamppost, his posture relaxed, but his gaze fixed. His name was Daniel. Tall, with dark hair and a scarf wrapped loosely around his neck, he had the air of someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere all at once. He wasn't watching her in a way that felt intrusive, but rather with the quiet curiosity of someone piecing together a puzzle. Eliza noticed him out of the corner of her eye and quickly looked away, her heart skipping a beat. She wasn't sure if it was fear, intrigue, or both. People didn't usually notice her. Not like that, not in this city. Daniel pushed off the lamppost, crossing the street with an easy stride. He stopped a few feet away, his breath visible in the frosty air. "Excuse me," he began, his voice smooth but hesitant, as though he was testing the waters. "I couldn't help but notice you look contemplative. Rough day?" Eliza blinked, caught off guard. "Not particularly, just thinking." "Thinking," he repeated, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Dangerous pastime." Despite herself, she smiled. "Depends on what you're thinking about." "True enough," Daniel said, stepping closer. "Mind if I join you? Or is this one of those sacred solo coffee moments?" Eliza hesitated, but then gestured to the empty space beside her. "Be my guest." They stood there for a while, exchanging small talk that felt surprisingly natural. Daniel told her he was a journalist in town for a story that he frustratingly couldn't share too much about. Eliza, in turn, spoke vaguely about her job as a graphic designer and her love for photography. There was a quiet intensity to their conversation, the kind that made the rest of the world blur into the background. Daniel had a way of making her feel seen, as though every word she said mattered. It was unsettling, but also exhilarating. As the evening wore on, they decided to go inside the cafe, where the warmth of the fire and the hum of conversation made the space feel alive. They sat in a corner, laughing over shared stories and stolen glances. Eliza hadn't felt this comfortable with someone in years, and she could see that Daniel felt the same. Then, as they were finishing their second round of coffee, Daniel leaned back in his chair and studied her. "Eliza," he began, his tone suddenly serious, "have you ever had the feeling that your life is about to change? Like you're standing on the edge of something big, and you're not sure if you should jump or step back?" She frowned slightly, taken aback by the question. "I think everyone feels that way at some point. Why?" Daniel hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. When he looked back up, there was a vulnerability in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Because meeting you tonight feels like one of those moments. And I don't say that lightly." Her heart fluttered, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. "Daniel, I..." Before she could finish, the sound of her phone buzzing on the table broke the moment. She glanced at the screen and froze. The text was from a number she hadn't seen in years, one she had desperately tried to forget. "We need to talk. You can't hide forever." Eliza's breath caught in her throat, and she quickly turned the phone face down, her hands trembling slightly. "Everything okay?" Daniel asked, his brow furrowed. Yeah, she lied, forcing a smile. Just work stuff. But Daniel didn't look convinced. If you ever need to talk about it, I'm here, he said softly. She nodded, but her mind was racing. Later that night, as she walked back to her apartment, the city's streets felt colder and quieter than usual. She replayed the evening in her head, trying to make sense of the way Daniel had made her feel and the sudden intrusion of her past. When she reached her building, she found a small envelope taped to her door. Her name was written on it in elegant cursive. With shaking hands, she opened it and pulled out a single piece of paper. You were warned, Eliza. He's not who you think he is. Her blood ran cold as she looked over her shoulder, the shadows of the streets stretching long and dark. Somewhere in the distance, a figure watched her from the corner, their face obscured by the night. And for the first time in years, Eliza felt truly afraid. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past. The cold seemed to seep through the walls of Eliza's apartment as she locked the door behind her, leaning against it for support. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as her eyes darted to the letter in her hand. The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet the words carried a sinister weight that tugged at old wounds she had desperately tried to leave behind. Her phone buzzed again, startling her. The same unknown number flashed on the screen. "Did you get my message?" Eliza didn't reply. Instead, she tossed the phone onto the kitchen counter, her hands trembling. The memories she had buried so carefully threatened to resurface, clawing their way into her mind. But she couldn't afford to spiral now, not with someone, whoever they were, watching her. Taking a deep breath, she moved to the window, peeking through the curtains. The street below was empty, save for a few parked cars and a lamppost casting an eerie glow. There was no sign of the figure she had seen earlier, but that didn't mean they weren't out there. Eliza spent the night on edge, every creak of the floorboards and howl of the wind making her flinch. She tried to distract herself by focusing on Daniel. His smile, his warmth, the way he had made her feel safe, even if only for a few hours. But then the warning from the letter echoed in her mind. He's not who you think he is. By morning, she was exhausted but resolute. If her past was coming for her, she needed answers. And fast. Later that day, Eliza found herself at a crowded cafe, her hands wrapped around a fresh cup of coffee as she waited. Daniel arrived a few minutes late, his scarf tucked neatly into his coat and a warm smile on his face. "Sorry," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. "Journalist hours aren't exactly punctual hours." She forced a smile, studying him closely. His presence was disarming, but now she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. "You look tired," he said, tilting his head. "Rough night?" "You could say that," Eliza replied. She hesitated, debating whether to confront him. Finally, she decided to take a more cautious route. You mentioned last night that you're here for a story. What kind of story is it?" Daniel chuckled, his expression softening. "You don't waste time, do you? It's nothing glamorous, I promise. Just a piece on urban legends in Montreal, ghost stories, mysterious disappearances, stuff like that." Eliza's heart skipped a beat. "Disappearances?" she repeated, her voice quieter. "Yeah. There's this one case I've been digging into, an artist who went missing a few years back. Her work was unsettling, to say the least. Lots of people think she knew something she wasn't supposed to." "Do you think that's true?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Maybe. Or maybe someone wanted people to think that. Either way, it's a rabbit hole." The conversation left her unsettled, though she tried to mask it. They talked about lighter things after that, but her mind kept circling back to the letter and the strange coincidence of Daniel's story. That evening, Eliza returned to her apartment to find the door slightly ajar. Her pulse quickened as she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. Nothing appeared out of place, but there was an undeniable sense that someone had been there. On her kitchen counter was another note. "Ask him about the artist." Her hands clenched the paper as dread pooled in her stomach. She grabbed her phone and dialed Daniel's number. "Hey," he answered, his voice calm and familiar. "What's up?" "Daniel," she began, her voice shaky. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. The artist you mentioned earlier, what's her name?" There was a pause, just long enough to make her stomach churn. Why do you want to know? Just answer me. He sighed. Her name was Elise Laurent. Why? Eliza froze. The name hit her like a freight train. Elise Laurent wasn't just some missing artist. She had been her mentor, her friend, and the reason she had fled her old life. Elise had stumbled upon something dark, something dangerous, and Eliza had been too scared to stick around and find out what. Eliza? Daniel's voice broke through her thoughts. I knew her, she whispered. What? His tone shifted, his curiosity laced with something harder to place. I knew Elise. We worked together before she disappeared. There was silence on the other end, but Eliza thought she could hear the faint sound of him breathing. Eliza, he finally said, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. You need to trust me. Whatever you're caught up in, I'm not your enemy. But someone thinks you are, she replied, gripping the phone tighter. What are you talking about? I got another note. It said to ask you about the artist. This time, the pause was longer. When Daniel finally spoke, his words sent a chill down her spine. Where are you right now? In my apartment, she said cautiously. You need to leave. Now. Why? Because if someone left you that note, they're probably still watching. And if they're watching you, they know about me. I'll explain everything, but you have to trust me. Go somewhere public and call me when you're there. Eliza's mind raced. She wanted to trust him, but the warnings, the notes, and the ghosts of her past all screamed for her to run. Instead, she grabbed her coat and headed for the door. But as she stepped into the hallway, her phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number. He's lying to you. Don't go anywhere with him. Eliza froze, torn between two equally terrifying choices. Chapter 3. The Crossroads. Eliza stood frozen in the dim hallway of her apartment building, her breath caught between the cold air and the suffocating weight of uncertainty. The text on her phone screen seemed to glow ominously, its message clear yet maddeningly vague. He's lying to you. Don't go anywhere with him. She clenched her fists, her mind racing. Trust Daniel, or trust the anonymous warning? Neither option felt safe. She glanced down the corridor, its flickering lights casting erratic shadows. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but where could she go? Her phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from Daniel. Eliza, please, I can protect you, but you have to move now. Torn, she stepped back into her apartment and slammed the door shut. She locked it and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. Her mind flashed back to Elise Laurent, to the strange warnings the artist had shared before she disappeared. Elise had spoken of people watching, listening, and waiting. Eliza had dismissed it as paranoia at the time. Now it seemed terrifyingly real. The memory stung. Elise had trusted her, and Eliza had run. Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint knock at her door. Eliza, came Daniel's voice, muffled but unmistakable. It's me. Her blood ran cold. How had he gotten here so quickly? She hadn't told him where she lived. Open the door, he said, his tone calm but urgent. You're not safe alone. Eliza pressed her back against the wall, her pulse hammering in her ears. She didn't respond. Eliza, Daniel called again, more forcefully this time. I know you're scared, but you need to trust me. Whoever is after you, they won't stop. But I can help. She stared at the door, every instinct screaming at her to stay silent. Then she heard it, a faint rustling sound, like paper sliding under the door. Her heart pounding, she hesitated before stepping forward. On the floor lay a folded note. Slowly, she picked it up and unfolded it. He knows about Elise. Ask him what happened to her. Her breath hitched. Whoever was behind the notes wasn't just trying to warn her. They knew details she had never shared with anyone, not even Elise's family. Eliza's fingers trembled as she called through the door. Daniel, how did you know Elise? There was a pause, and then Daniel's voice softened. I didn't know her personally. I've been investigating her case for months. I think she was silenced because of what she uncovered. What did she uncover? Eliza pressed, her voice shaking. I don't have all the pieces yet, he admitted. But Elise was onto something big, a network of people with influence and power who would do anything to stay in the shadows. She tried to expose them, and, well, you know what happened. Eliza's mind raced. His story lined up with what she knew, but the coincidences were too perfect. Could she really trust him? Her phone buzzed again. This time, the message was chillingly direct. He works for them. Eliza's knees nearly buckled. The room seemed to spin as fear and doubt took hold. Was Daniel truly trying to help her, or was he leading her into a trap? "You're lying," she said through the door, her voice stronger now. "What?" Daniel sounded genuinely confused. "You work for them, don't you? That's how you know so much. That's how you found me." "No," he said, his voice rising in alarm. "Eliza, I don't work for anyone. I'm trying to help you because—" The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Daniel cut himself off. "Eliza," he whispered urgently, "someone's coming. You need to let me in, or we're both in danger." Eliza's heart raced as she looked through the peephole. Two figures in dark coats were approaching, their faces obscured. She didn't recognize them, but their purposeful strides sent a clear message. They were here for her. She had seconds to decide. Against her better judgment, she pulled the chair away and unlocked the door, yanking it open. Daniel stepped inside quickly, closing the door behind him and locking it. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. Eliza backed away from him, her arms crossed defensively. "Start talking. Who are those people?" Daniel peeked through the curtains, his face grim. "They're part of the network Elise was investigating. They must have realized you're connected to her." "Why would they come after me now?" "Because you're the last loose end," he said, turning to her. "And they don't leave loose ends." Before she could respond, a loud knock echoed through the apartment. "Eliza Laurent," a deep voice called. "We know you're in there. Open the door." Eliza's blood froze. "Laurent?" she whispered. Daniel's expression darkened. "They think you're her." "What?" "Elise used an alias," Daniel explained hurriedly. "She probably used your name somewhere to protect herself. They must think you're the artist." The pounding on the door grew louder. "Eliza, we don't have much time," Daniel said, his voice urgent. "I need you to trust me." She stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. He had been kind to her, warm and attentive, but the doubts lingered. The door shook violently as the figures began forcing it open. Daniel reached for her hand. "We need to go. Now." But then she noticed something, a faint glint of silver beneath his sleeve. A bracelet? No, it was too intricate, too deliberate. It looked like a badge. She stepped back. "You're lying," she said, her voice barely audible. "What are you talking about?" Daniel asked, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of panic. Eliza glanced at the door, then back at him. She had only seconds to act. Grabbing the chair, she hurled it at the window, shattering the glass. Cold air rushed in, carrying the sounds of the street below. Without hesitation, she climbed onto the sill and jumped. The last thing she heard was Daniel shouting her name as she disappeared into the night. When Eliza hit the ground, pain shot through her ankle, but adrenaline kept her moving. She limped into the maze of alleys behind her building, her mind spinning. Who could she trust? Where could she go? As she disappeared into the shadows, one thing was clear. Her past wasn't just catching up to her. It was hunting her, and the game was far from over. Chapter 4. Into the Unknown. Eliza's breath came in short, frantic bursts as she stumbled through the narrow alleys of Montreal. Her ankle throbbed, but she pushed through the pain, weaving through the darkened streets. She had no clear destination, no plan, only the gnawing, desperate need to escape whoever was chasing her. Her mind raced, but the most pressing question clung to the forefront. Why did Daniel lie? The broken window behind her was evidence of her desperation, and the sound of distant voices told her she hadn't outrun them yet. The figures in the hallway, those who believed she was Elise, hadn't been human, not in the way she understood. They were methodical, calculating, and they didn't make mistakes. They would be searching for her, tracking her every move. Her heart pounded in her chest, but there was no time to waste on guilt or fear. Daniel's betrayal cut deep, but it had become clear that he was far more entangled in this web than he let on. How much did he know? Had he truly been trying to protect her, or was he just another puppet in a much darker game? Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She flinched, but it was a fleeting hesitation. She had to check, though she feared what she might find. Her fingers fumbled as she pulled it out, her hands slick with sweat. It was from Daniel. "Eliza, please. You're in danger. I didn't want this for you. Just meet me at the old warehouse by the docks. Please. They're not far behind." She swallowed hard, the fear still clawing at her throat. The docks. That was the last place she wanted to go. but something in his message made her hesitate, a small flicker of doubt about his guilt. He hadn't told her about the docks before. How did he know where she'd go? Eliza glanced around, the echo of footsteps growing louder. They were getting closer. The note on her door earlier had been right. Daniel was involved, but how deeply? Was he just playing a part, or had he been a pawn all along? Her mind churned, but she knew one thing for sure. If she was going to make it out of this alive, she needed answers. And if Daniel wasn't part of the enemy she'd been running from, he might still have the key. With a glance over her shoulder, Eliza made a decision. She had to go to the warehouse. The streets blurred around her as she headed toward the docks, her footsteps muffled by the thick layers of snow that had begun to fall again. She could barely feel the cold anymore, only the sharp edges of the decision she'd just made. As she neared the water, the towering, dilapidated buildings of the warehouse district loomed ahead, their skeletal structures casting long, dark shadows. Her breath came in ragged bursts, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. The silence of the docks was almost oppressive, broken only by the distant creaking of old boats and the occasional flurry of wind. Then she saw him. Daniel stood near one of the warehouse entrances, his back to her. He was alone, his posture tense, as though he was waiting for something or someone. Eliza froze, a wave of doubt crashing over her. Was this a trap? Was she walking into an even deeper lie? But as she stepped forward, Daniel turned around, his eyes wide with relief when they met hers. "You came," he said, his voice shaky, almost as if he hadn't expected her to. "You said you were going to protect me," Eliza replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "Why didn't you tell me everything? Why didn't you tell me who you really are?" Daniel lowered his gaze, his face shadowed by guilt. "I never wanted to involve you in this. I thought I could keep you safe, keep it all at arm's length. But it's too late for that now." "Too late for what? Elise, she didn't just vanish. She faked her death. She faked it to protect you." Eliza's blood ran cold. "What? But why would she?" "Because she knew they would come for you. The moment you met her, you were tied to her. They thought you knew too much. They thought you were the one." "But I'm not Elise," Eliza exclaimed, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "I know," Daniel said quietly, "but they don't care. They don't see you as you. They see you as the threat." Eliza took a step back, her mind reeling. "What do you mean? What threat? What are you talking about?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his frustration palpable. "The people Elise was involved with, they're powerful, dangerous. They have their fingers in everything, from politics to corporate empires. They operate in the shadows, and they don't care who gets hurt. Elise had uncovered something so dangerous it could bring them all down, and she made you a part of it, whether she meant to or not." Eliza shook her head, trying to process his words. "I don't understand. I don't know anything about this. Elise never told me any of this." "She didn't have to. She knew you'd be the one to stop them. You're her legacy, whether you want it or not." A sudden noise cut through their conversation, a car's engine revving in the distance. Eliza's head snapped around, and her heart leapt in her chest. The unmistakable sound of footsteps followed. "They're here," Daniel said, his face paling. "We don't have much time." Before Eliza could ask him what he meant, two figures emerged from the shadows, walking toward them with purposeful strides. Their eyes were cold and calculating. Eliza instinctively took a step back. "Eliza Laurent," one of the men said, his voice a low growl. "We've been looking for you." Eliza's stomach churned. The man's voice held the kind of authority that made it clear they weren't just here for a conversation. "Stay away from her," Daniel shouted, stepping in front of Eliza, protectively. "Don't get in our way, Daniel," the other man said, his tone almost mocking. "This doesn't concern you anymore." Eliza could see the conflict in Daniel's eyes, the way his jaw tightened as though he were trying to decide whether to fight or run. "Please," Daniel whispered to Eliza, his voice desperate. "You don't have to do this. Just trust me." For a moment, Eliza hesitated. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that this was all some horrible misunderstanding. But everything, her past, Elisa's warning, the notes, the chase, told her otherwise. "Run, Eliza. Run, or you'll never have a chance." Without another word, Eliza turned and bolted into the shadows of the docks, her legs carrying her faster than she thought possible. Behind her, she could hear Daniel shouting her name, but she couldn't stop now. The cold air bit at her skin as she ran, the sound of footsteps growing louder and closer. She had no idea where she was going, only that the only way to survive was to keep running. And as the night swallowed her whole, she realized something. Her past wasn't just chasing her. It was closing in, faster than she could outrun it. Chapter 5. The Final Truth. Eliza's breath burned in her lungs as she sprinted through the maze of warehouses, the sharp, bitter wind cutting across her face. Her shoes slapped against the wet pavement, echoing in the hollow emptiness of the dockside. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't. If she did, she knew the figures chasing her would be right on her heels, and she would be trapped. The distant sound of shouting and footsteps behind her only fueled her desperation. They were close. Too close. But there had to be a way out. There had to be. She spotted a narrow alley between two crumbling buildings, a potential escape route. With no time to think, she veered toward it, her heart thundering in her chest. The alley was dark and full of obstacles, rusted metal debris, discarded crates, and piles of old newspapers, but she forced herself through it, hoping it would lead her somewhere safer. But as she reached the end of the alley, her foot caught on a piece of debris and she stumbled. A sharp pain shot up her leg, but she didn't stop. The sound of approaching footsteps was deafening now. Her body was screaming. Her mind was numb with panic, but she couldn't afford to slow down. She reached the street beyond the alley, looking frantically for any sign of help, anything that could protect her. The docks were empty, save for a few old fishing boats and scattered trash. The streets stretched out, silent, as though the world had abandoned her. Suddenly, a hand clamped down on her arm. Eliza gasped, whipping around to find Daniel standing behind her, his face frantic. "Eliza," he gasped, holding her tightly. "You have to listen to me. Why should I trust you?" Eliza's voice cracked with fear and frustration. "Why should I believe anything you say?" Daniel's eyes searched hers with a desperation she hadn't seen before. "Because I'm the one who's been trying to protect you. This isn't just about Elise anymore. It's about you and what you've become. You're a target because of the secrets you don't even know you hold." Eliza recoiled, her eyes narrowing. "What secrets? I don't even know what's going on." "They think you're Elise. They think you have the information she uncovered, the key to everything. The truth about the people who've been controlling everything in the shadows." His grip tightened. "The truth about who they really are." Eliza stared at him, her mind reeling. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture it formed was something she couldn't quite comprehend. She thought of Elise, the artist who had disappeared, whose work had become the stuff of whispered legends. She thought of the men who had been chasing her, and the unsettling realization that they hadn't just been hunting her for her connection to Elise. They were after the truth she carried without even knowing it. "What do you mean, the truth?" Eliza whispered, her voice trembling. "What is it I'm supposed to know?" Before Daniel could respond, the first of the pursuers appeared at the end of the street, silhouetted against the dim light. Eliza could see the unmistakable glint of weapons, guns, knives, tools of control. The air around them was charged with the cold certainty of an approaching storm. "We don't have much time," Daniel said urgently. "You need to listen to me, Eliza. The truth about Elise, about everything, is here. Right here." He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his coat pocket and handed it to her. "This is the key. This will explain everything." Eliza's hands shook as she unfolded the paper, her heart pounding as she scanned the words written in a hurried, barely legible script. "The truth is within you, hidden in your blood. The key to the network's downfall lies in what you are, not who you are. They fear what you don't remember, but you must remember." Eliza blinked, trying to process the cryptic message. "What does this mean? What am I supposed to do with this?" Daniel stepped closer, his face tense with urgency. "You were never just Elise's protege. You were part of something bigger, something more dangerous. You're connected to the people who've been controlling this city, who've been manipulating everything from the shadows. And Elise..." He paused, his voice catching. "She died trying to protect you, trying to keep them from finding out what you could do. Eliza's pulse quickened as the weight of his words sank in. What are you saying? Elise found out the truth, Daniel continued, his voice breaking. She discovered that you, your bloodline, was the key to unlocking their power. She didn't want you to become a weapon, Eliza. But now they're after you because they know you're the only one who can stop them, and the only way to stop them is for you to remember who you are. Eliza's head swam with confusion. I don't understand. I've never been part of anything like that. You are now, Daniel said, his voice grim. You're their only hope and their greatest threat. Just then, the first of the men reached them, stepping into the dim light, a cruel smile on his lips. You really think she's going to save you, Daniel? He sneered. She's already dead in our eyes. We've been waiting for this moment for a long time, and now she's ours. Eliza's blood ran cold as the other figures emerged, their faces obscured by masks. They moved toward her, their eyes cold and calculating, but something in her stirred. Something ancient, something that wasn't quite hers, but was. Without thinking, she stepped back, her hand instinctively reaching for something she couldn't quite grasp. But as she did, a surge of energy rushed through her, something fierce and untamed. Her vision blurred for a split second as the ground beneath her seemed to crack. The air around them seemed to hum with an unnatural force. The men faltered, their expressions shifting from smug certainty to confusion, then fear. Eliza could feel the power pulsing inside her, growing with every heartbeat. She had no idea what it was, where it came from, or how to control it, but it was there, filling her with a strength she had never known. Eliza, Daniel whispered, his eyes wide in awe. You're awakening it. She didn't need to understand it fully. She didn't need to control it yet. She just needed to survive. And in that moment, she knew exactly what she had to do. With one swift motion, she raised her hand, and a shockwave erupted from her body, sending the men flying back into the walls of the nearby buildings. The force of the blast cracked the pavement and shattered windows, sending a rain of glass down around them. Eliza stood there, trembling as the silence settled in. The men were unconscious, scattered and broken on the ground. Daniel stared at her in disbelief, his mouth hanging open. You really are the one, he breathed. Eliza took a deep breath, still trembling, but now with a newfound sense of clarity. The battle wasn't over. The truth wasn't fully revealed. But one thing was certain. This wasn't just Elisa's fight anymore. It was hers, and no one was going to control her again.